Last year, at the America's Newspapers Mega Conference, I moderated one of the most spirited discussions we've ever had on E&P reports. The question was simple: should opinion journalism evolve or disappear? Now, nobody suggested that news publishers should abandon opinion altogether, but everyone agreed something wasn't working. Since then, things actually haven't gotten any calmer. Editors are dropping political endorsements. Some are dropping comment sections. One publisher recently stopped printing political letters altogether, and the readers thanked her for it. Meanwhile, television networks now debate whether they should even carry presidential speeches live. So many questions. But the real question really is, can journalism still create a place where Americans disagree without tearing each other apart? Hi, I'm Mike Blinder, publisher of E&P Magazine. This, as always, is E&P Reports, our weekly vodcast series that explores the people, organizations, and issues shaping the evolving news publishing industry. And if you're a regular E&P reader, you know today's guest. Stuart Brotman is one of America's foremost scholars on constitutional law, media policy, and the First Amendment. He joined us last December on this program to discuss the growing pressure on free expression. But I want him back because over the past several months, he's written a series of columns that don't simply analyze the First Amendment. They ask whether we're losing the civic culture that allows free expression to actually work. And judging by the response we're getting, he's struck a nerve. We'll break this all down and explain right after this. Stick around.
Hello, my name is Walter Hussman. Our family has been in the news business for over 100 years. Journalism includes two parts: reporting the news and providing opinions. But in recent years, there's been too much opinion appearing in news reporting. This has eroded public trust in news reporting to the lowest level of any U.S. institution. To address this, we started a nonprofit, the Center for Integrity in News Reporting.
The Center for Integrity in News Reporting, CFINR, is on a mission to rebuild public trust in journalism, one newsroom and one classroom at a time. We champion the effort to have news organizations and journalism schools create and prominently display their own clear, concise statements of core journalistic values. Learn more by visiting the Center for Integrity and News Reporting site at cfinr.org.
Stuart, it's so great to have you back. Last time you were on, we focused on the First Amendment and the growing pressures on free expression. Since then, you've written a series of columns for us that have clearly resonated with publishers across the country. In fact, one of them prompted an email that I think perfectly frames today's conversation. It came from Deborah Fitzgerald, editor of the Peninsula Pulse in Door County, Wisconsin, about 27,000 circulation hyper-local newspaper. And you may remember Deborah wrote this. She told you that over the years, their letters to the editor page had gradually become less about local issues and more about national political fights. She found herself spending hours editing letters filled with inaccuracies, partisan attacks, misinformation, arguments that really had nothing to do with the communities she served. So she made a very difficult decision. She stopped publishing political letters. She said there was uproar at first. This is what's so interesting. But later, readers started writing again about schools, local government, parks, development, community events, issues that directly affected their neighbors. So, Stuart, let me tie this together. I know it's a long question, but last year at America's Newspapers Mega Conference, I moderated a panel about should opinion journalism evolve or disappear? Now, at that time, it seemed like a fascinating industry debate. But after reading Deborah's email, I'm wondering if you're moved beyond that discussion entirely. Here's the question. Can newspapers still provide a place where communities disagree respectively? That's the question I really want to pose to you today. When you read her email, what struck you the most?
Well, Mike, it's great to be here. And I was very impressed and moved by Deborah's letter. So let me reflect a little bit on that. I guess the short answer is absolutely, meaning that I think it's important, particularly at the local level, for editors and editorial boards to retain editorial voices. So part of opinion journalism should be having those voices by editors expressed. So to some extent, they're helping to both moderate and to educate the public about how to essentially offer feedback to the news organization. So what we see now, obviously, is a lot of polarization, a lot of people who are venting when they're responding. But again, we need a little bit of modeling. And I think editorial boards and editors can help moderate that process by essentially having editorials which might focus on local issues. That way, when people read about them, they want to respond to what the editorial voice is saying. And I think part of that dialogue has been lost. And because of that, it tends to be somewhat of a one-way street where people are just venting back to the news organization as opposed to having a conversation.
But did you see her decision as limiting free expression or protecting free expression? This is the conundrum that I'm turning around in my brain.
Well, I think it actually can be expanding because, again, free expression is free expression for the newspaper or the news organization. And clearly, I think a number of those organizations have not been promoting that free expression through their editorial voices. And by doing so, they can help promote readers and listeners and viewers to offer that feedback. So it's really a great opportunity, I think, for the news business to sort of get back into the game and think about how their editorial voices are being used and how they're going to be able to project themselves.
All right, but if an editor knows a letter and they know, fact, contains misinformation, inflammatory rhetoric, or accusations that can't be verified, but the writer believes every single word, which responsibility comes first? The writer's right to be heard or the news publisher's responsibility for accuracy to its readers?
Well, there's no right to be heard. And as we know, there's a seminal U.S. Supreme Court case, the Miami Herald versus Tornillo case, which is from 1968, which essentially says there's no right of access to a newspaper. So any individual doesn't have a right to send a letter or upload a letter and have it published or printed. So there is no right at that basis, and you're not restricting anything based on a legal right. What you're doing in promoting free expression is to say, we want the community to offer feedback and to offer constructive ideas about our community. And in order to do that, again, I don't want to beat the dead horse. I think it's important for editorial groups to essentially take the lead and help to model. We do that as parents and as adults and as leaders. Modeling is important here. And I think to some extent, part of the problem is there has not been sufficient modeling done, meaning that when people are venting, they vent obviously from an emotional place, but they also vent because they haven't been taught or haven't been guided as to how to essentially offer proper responses. And this is not something that's going to be solved overnight, but it's something I think that could be addressed immediately and then worked on over time.
Now, the challenge I have here is, Stuart, that you're like episode number 333. We've been doing this for years, and people go back. So I'm going to date stamp us now. It's now mid-July 2026. Just a few days ago, President Donald Trump addressed the nation in a presidential primetime speech. ABC and NBC chose not to air it live. CBS aired it, but surrounded it with fact-checking and context. Fox News aired it and then immediately acknowledged that it had not independently verified several of the president's claims. CNN chose not to carry it at all. As a constitutional scholar, someone who studied journalism for decades, what did you make of these editorial decisions that were made around that presidential address, sir?
Well, it's great that individual editors can make individual editorial decisions. And obviously, what we see here is that range of editorial decisions. ABC and NBC decided editorially up front that they believe this was not essentially a good use of airtime for airing this address because it didn't contain news or it didn't contain appropriate facts or they weren't able to do fact checking in real time. CBS decided, yes, it is news, so we need to cover it, but we also need to essentially build in a fact checking mechanism. And Fox and Friends, which is not really a news program, decided they were not going to essentially discuss this the morning after. So these are almost case studies in three different types of editorial decisions. I think the good news now is that we have this range of editorial decisions. I think many people remember once upon a time when the president said he was going to address the nation. Essentially, all of the major broadcast networks and the cable networks cleared that time immediately without questioning what are you going to talk about, without looking at some potential factual errors that might be built in there. And those days are gone, not just in terms of the current president, but as we know, this also happened with Biden and Obama when the networks decided, well, maybe this speech is just going to be a political speech dressed up as a presidential address. So I think this is actually a good development, which is editorial decision making. And we see more editors now making individual decisions as opposed to saying we're offering carte blanche access.
I wrote an op-ed about this, and some people responded to it by saying, and again, I want you to clarify this for me because you're the scholar, not me. Some people actually said the First Amendment requires a newsroom to provide a live platform to every statement made by a president. What say you to those comments I received from the readers of ENP?
I say no, no, no. That's absolutely incorrect. Remember, what the First Amendment does is it presents a barrier between the government and our citizens and our people who are watching and accessing news. And so it essentially says government cannot impose an obligation of any news organization to carry that. So it's actually what the response you've gotten is a reversal of what the First Amendment actually says. We don't have something where the government would say, you must carry this particular address. And I think that's what some of these folks were saying.
All right, your recent columns, I want to switch gears a bit because we only have a little bit of your time. Your recent columns suggested that America isn't simply facing a legal challenge to the First Amendment. We're facing a cultural one. This really resonated with our readers. Would you say the Constitution is holding up better than our ability to engage to engage each other respectfully in today's ecosystem?
Absolutely. And that's one of the sort of great dichotomies or tensions that's going on. The law is pretty stable. And as we've seen, and as I reflected in a recent column in Editor and Publisher, we see a number of judges, particularly at the federal district level, coming up with some very strong and eloquent opinions about the First Amendment. And so we see that the First Amendment as a legal doctrine tends to be quite stable. I mean, most recently, we had a case where essentially the New York Times versus Sullivan doctrine, which is the actual malice standard for public officials and public figures, the court decided that it would not even review a case dealing with that. And that, I think, sent a strong signal that the doctrine of New York Times versus Sullivan, which is one of the bedrock aspects of the First Amendment, is quite stable. But you're absolutely right in terms of the disconnect between the stability of the legal doctrine and the culture that we see around free expression. That's clearly fraying.
All right, so let's shift gears again now. I only have a few minutes of your time. You spent decades studying constitutional law and journalism. If I handed you the keys to a local community newspaper today, right now, what would your opinion page look like? Would you publish political letters? Would you moderate them differently? Or would you reinvent the entire thing? What would you do if you had that local news publishing outlet today, sir?
Well, I do a few different things. One of the things I've reflected on in a recent column was the notion of the disconnect, or at least the gap between younger news consumers, older news consumers. And we see data after data showing us that the younger news consumer has not really developed a news habit. And so part of it is, how do we begin to appeal to younger news consumers? And so part of it may be, for example, having responses or letters to the editor which reflect younger voices, as well as people who are saying, gee, I don't like this because this is what we used to be doing here. So I think to some extent, showing that the news organization, newspaper, is open to younger voices might be a good way to help develop a news habit among those local readers and viewers. So that would be one. Now, number two, obviously, reinstate a letters to the editor page or column, and do it on a regular basis. What we've seen is a number of newspapers essentially no longer reprint an letter to the editor in full. They would just excerpt it with a few lines. So why don't you actually have a full letter to the editor, which is there and is featured, obviously, either on the homepage or with a link, and do it on a daily basis. And clearly, if we're talking about that dialogue between the editorial voice and the reader's voice, if you have readers responding to an editorial or an editorial voice, reprint that voice so that people understand what is the nature of the response that people are generating. And so I think that's also another example that would be useful.
All right, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, I have a long list, obviously. The notion of ombudsman, basically is dead at this point in the news business. So we have virtually no major newspaper, no major news organization except NPR and except for CBS by virtue of its acquisition by Skydance. There's a legal provision which requires that CBS have an ombudsman. But I think news organizations, local news organizations, can redevelop an ombudsman. That doesn't mean they're going to necessarily have the money to hire a full-time person. But most communities have a journalism school or a community college which offers journalism. And it may be that they can work in conjunction with one of those organizations to offer essentially what I would call ombuds services. We see that with NPR. So NPR obviously decided it could not afford to support a full-time ombudsman or ombudsperson anymore. So it went to the Poynter Institute and said, would you work with us? And when we have complaints coming in, would you essentially look at them and give us some appropriate responses? Well, that could be done at the local level as well. And I think, again, one of the major issues here is also trust in journalism, because clearly we see that trust in journalism is declining and needs to be rebuilt. And if we have readers and viewers saying, gee, this news organization wants to keep itself honest, they're actually looking at complaints and they're responding to complaints, and they're offering us a feedback loop, and they are speaking so that we understand what their position is. So this is sort of a multidimensional problem or area that I think could be addressed, but I think it needs to be done in that multidimensional way.
Stuart, every time you're on this program, you remind us that the First Amendment isn't just something argued in courtrooms. It's something editors, publishers, news media executives wrestle with every damn day under very extraordinary pressure. I have a feeling this conversation is going to continue well beyond this interview. I look forward to the next column you pen for us at E&P. I thank you for your valuable time, and thanks again for your insight, sir.
Good, thanks. Great to be with you, Mike.